No police department in the country has had problems like Miami's. 1/10 of the force, almost 100 officers, is off the job. Some of them suspended, others fired. A lot of them indicted or convicted of serious crimes, including the theft of a ton of cocaine. One of the officers even pled guilty to murder.
These weren't just crooked cops. They were the worst nightmare of drug cartels and honest lawmen. In Miami's darkest era, police officers posing as heroes ambushed smugglers on the river, stole tons of cocaine worth millions, and even killed to cover it up. This is the story of how the police became the dealers, and how everything began to unravel in the worst way imaginable. We're talking about the Miami River Cops, a group of young City of Miami police officers who between 1984 and 1985 turned their badges into weapons of robbery, their cruisers into cocaine transport vehicles, and the Miami River into their personal hunting ground. By the time it was over, 19 officers had been convicted of crimes including murder, racketeering, and drug trafficking, with sentences averaging 23 years. Nearly 100 officers, roughly 10% of the entire Miami Police Department, were arrested, fired, suspended, or reprimanded. This is the story of 1984 to 1995, the era when the line between cop and criminal didn't just blur, it was erased entirely, and the consequences shook American law enforcement to its core. To understand how cops became cartel-level drug dealers, you first have to understand what Miami looked like in the early 1980s. Because this wasn't a normal American city, this was ground zero of the cocaine wars. By 1981, Miami was the gateway for 70% of all cocaine entering the United States. Drug trafficking generated an estimated $7 billion per year in Florida alone, dwarfing the state's entire citrus industry. The economic distortion was staggering. In 1979, the Federal Reserve's Miami branch reported a $5 billion cash surplus, more than every other Federal Reserve branch in the country combined. Drug money was literally propping up the city's economy, fueling 25,000 legitimate jobs in banking, real estate, and construction. And the violence? It was apocalyptic. Miami's murder rate hit 62 per 100,000 residents in 1980, the highest in the nation. That year saw 573 homicides in the metro area. The Dade County Medical Examiner's office ran out of room for bodies and had to lease a refrigerated Burger King delivery truck at $800 a month just to store the overflow. That truck stayed in service for 8 years. Then came two back-to-back crises that pushed the city past its breaking point. In May 1980, the Liberty City riots erupted after 4 officers were acquitted in the beating death of a black insurance salesman named Arthur McDuffie. 18 people died. Simultaneously, the Mariel boat lift brought 125,000 Cuban refugees to South Florida in just 6 months, increasing Miami's population by nearly 10% overnight. The Miami Police Department was catastrophically overwhelmed, and here's where the seeds of the scandal were planted. Because the department hadn't hired a single new officer in 5 years. Under pressure from a federal consent decree and desperate for manpower, they launched a massive hiring blitz. Between 1981 and 1983, approximately 714 officers were brought on, more than doubling the force in under 2 years. But here's the thing. Speed killed quality control. Background checks were gutted. The department accepted GEDs instead of diplomas, relaxed credit and driving record standards, dropped the swimming requirement, and weakened firearms testing. Some recruits had histories as gang members. Others had been fired from previous jobs for theft. A few were literally called out of the police academy to be served active warrants. The department's training director later admitted they knew these recruits were, in his words, time bombs. Sooner or later, they were going to go off. And when they did, it would be worse than anyone imagined, because these young, poorly vetted officers, mostly Hispanic men in their early 20s, were thrown onto the midnight shift in Little Havana, earning less than $500 a week, patrolling streets where drug dealers drove Mercedes-Benzes with hundreds of thousands in cash in their trunks. Every single night they were surrounded by more money than they'd see in a lifetime. Some of them decided to take it. It started small. In 1984, officers working the midnight shift in Little Havana began pulling over motorists who looked like drug dealers and pocketing whatever cash or cocaine they found. No paperwork, no arrests, no reports filed, just money that vanished into their pockets. But the escalation came fast. A bar owner named Luis Rodriguez, a petty crook and police informant, saw an opportunity to play both sides. He and his associate, a tough former Cuban political prisoner named Armando Unroque, started brokering deals. They'd arrange cocaine transactions with traffickers, then tip off the corrupt officers about the deliveries. The cops would intercept the shipment, steal the drugs, and Un would resell the cocaine on the street. Everyone got a cut. By late 1984, the officers had formalized their operation. They even gave themselves a name, the Enterprise. The core group included Armando Estrada, the alleged ringleader who'd been a gas station attendant making $4 an hour before joining the force. There was Rodolfo Rudy Arias, a former gas pumper who had actually been named Officer of the Month. Armando Scarface Garcia, Osvaldo Coelho, Arturo de la Vega, Ricardo Aleman, Roman Rodriguez, all in their mid-20s, all hired during the hiring blitz, all working the midnight shift. The small-time rip-offs, a few kilos here, a few dozen pounds of marijuana there, continued through early 1985, but then something changed. The ambitions got bigger, the targets got larger, and the consequences got deadly, because what happened next would turn a corruption case into a murder investigation. On May 31, 1985, officers raided a lobster boat at Nuta's boatyard on the Miami River. The official seizure was 850 pounds of the largest in Miami history, but smugglers later said more than 1,000 pounds had been aboard. Officers reportedly kept 147 kilos, worth approximately $2 million. When investigators noticed the discrepancy between what was reported and what had actually been on the boat, the first whispers of suspicion began. 6 weeks later, on July 13th, 10 to 11 Miami police officers, some in full uniform, stormed a pleasure boat called the Mitzi Ann at Tamiami Marina. The vessel held 400 kilograms of cocaine worth $10 million in hidden compartments. Officers climbed a 12-foot fence, beat the men on board, threw smugglers into the water, then formed a fire brigade line, passing cocaine packages hand over hand into their car trunks. One police cruiser was so packed with bricks of cocaine that officers had to tie the trunk shut. And then, 15 days later, came the night that gave this scandal its name. At approximately 1 in the morning on July 28, 1985, 6 men were working aboard a steel-hulled vessel called the Mary C, moored at Jones Boatyard on South River Drive along the Miami River. They had just finished extracting between 350 and 400 kilograms of cocaine, worth an estimated $10 to $12 million, from a hidden compartment and loading it into a brown van. Then came the pounding on the boatyard door. The night watchman, Robert Downs, looked through the glass and saw men in police uniforms. They told him there was a boat loaded with dope out there. Downs let them in. 7 to 8 men rushed the Mary C with weapons drawn. One of the surviving smugglers later testified that the attackers were shouting, them all, as they charged. All 6 men aboard panicked and jumped into the Miami River. 3 of them drowned, pulled under by the river's strong tidal currents. Their bodies surfaced the following day. The officers seized the van loaded with cocaine and told the watchman to open the gate. The entire operation took under 10 minutes. At 1:30 in the morning, Downs made a log entry that would become one of the most famous lines in the entire case. He wrote, "Vessel Mary C raided by police. Crew goes for swim." That cocaine was never entered as evidence. It was resold on the streets. Rudy Arias alone received 4 kilos as a gift from the other officers and sold them for $92,000. The next day, Luis Rodriguez, the bar owner who had been the key middleman between cops and dealers, was found, his body stuffed in a pine crate on a vacant lot, riddled with bullet holes. 3 people dead from drowning. 1 man executed. Millions in cocaine on the streets, and every last bit of it done by men wearing badges. The investigation started with a puzzle. When a Metro-Dade homicide detective named Alex Alvarez was called to examine the 3 bodies floating in the river, the scene initially looked like a standard drug deal gone wrong. But when Alvarez heard the night watchman's account of uniformed police raiding the Mary C, he searched for a corresponding police report. There wasn't one. From there, the case built piece by piece. Investigators issued more than 300 subpoenas for financial records and discovered spending patterns wildly inconsistent with police salaries. The lavish lifestyles these officers were living were impossible to hide. Osvaldo Coelho was driving a fire-engine red Lotus sports car worth $59,000 on a $25,000 a year salary. Just 2 days after resigning from the department, Coelho was arrested after leading police on a 120-mile-per-hour chase in the Lotus. Roman Rodriguez went on a shopping spree after the Jones Boat Yard heist, buying a $100,000 house, spending $24,000 on furniture, interior decorating, and a stereo system. Officers across the group were ordering satellite dishes, building new homes, establishing stock portfolios, and buying jewelry. Rudy Arias alone had cleared over $1 million from at least 13 documented drug ripoffs. Covert recordings captured officers discussing their crimes, and then the case cracked wide open. Officers were caught attempting to sell stolen cocaine directly to undercover federal agents. But here's where the story takes another turn, because the trials that followed would be anything but straightforward. The first arrests came in December 1985. The case moved to federal court in 1986, and the first trial began that September before Judge Kenneth Reiskamp. After nearly 4 months of testimony, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. In January 1987, Reiskamp declared a mistrial. It was a devastating blow to prosecutors. The turning point came when Rudy Arias flipped. Over weeks of debriefings, he produced a 122-page document that prosecutors called a gold mine of evidence. His testimony led to the indictment of 6 additional officers, but the defendants weren't going quietly. Investigators discovered that multiple officers had plotted to assassinate government witnesses. In one chilling episode, Arias, Coelho, De La Vega, and a civilian hitman surveilled a witness's house until 5 in the morning with MAC-10 machine guns, planning a drive-by shooting before ultimately abandoning the plot. Separately, officers hired the same hitman for $100,000 to another witness, but he pocketed $50,000, faked the attempt, and fled to California. Ricardo Aleman became the first river cop convicted by a jury in September 1987. In February 1988, Coelho was convicted and sentenced to 35 years, the longest term in the case. 10 officers ultimately pleaded guilty, and 2 were convicted at trial. Average sentences came to 23 years. Meanwhile, Armando "Scarface" Garcia vanished. He fled the country while out on bail and was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, number 423. For nearly 7 years, he evaded capture. Then, in January 1994, a tip from America's Most Wanted led Colombian police to arrest Garcia in Cali, Colombia. He was extradited, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to 25 years. The personal toll was staggering. Coelho's 66-year-old father, who had used his home as collateral on his son's bond, took his own life when the government moved to foreclose. The scandal forced an institutional reckoning. By 1987, 100 of Miami's 1,060 police officers were under investigation, nearly 1 in 10. The media tracked the case relentlessly. The appeals court noted approximately 330 newspaper articles in the case file alone. The department overhauled its hiring and screening processes, significantly strengthening background checks and reversing the lax standards that had allowed unsuitable candidates onto the force. Internal affairs was restructured. New accountability policies were implemented. A landmark 1998 federal report used Miami as a central case study, finding that drug-related corruption typically involved small groups of officers working together rather than lone individuals, a pattern the river cops had exemplified perfectly. But here's what makes this story endure beyond the headlines. The Miami river cops weren't born corrupt. They were manufactured by a system that prioritized quantity over quality, speed over safety, and learned too late that the line between cop and criminal, once erased, extracts a cost measured in decades. Approximately 12% of all officers hired during the 1981 to 1983 surge were eventually fired, suspended, or convicted of criminal charges. That's not a story about bad apples. That's a story about a broken barrel. The Miami River Cops didn't just steal cocaine and betray their badges. They shattered the public's trust in an entire police department during one of the most violent periods in American urban history. 19 convictions, 3 drowning deaths, 1 officer on the FBI's most wanted list. Millions in cocaine funneled right back onto the streets by the very people sworn to keep them safe. Every one of them has since been released from prison. Arias entered witness protection, lived in Louisiana, and eventually returned to Miami, where he worked as a chef. Garcia served his time and was released in the mid-2000s. The badges are gone. The sentences have been served. But the question remains, In a world where drugs still flood American cities, where police departments still face hiring shortages, and where the temptation of easy money never disappears, could it happen again? Thanks for watching.